Sarah Mitchell thought she was being punished when they assigned her to Warehouse 7. What she didn't know was that she was about to uncover the most dangerous smuggling operation in Port Authority history. If you believe expertise always finds a way to surface, stay tuned for what happens next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled off Lake Erie like a gray blanket, wrapping around the sprawling Cleveland Port Authority complex in a shroud that made the massive cargo containers appear and disappear like ghosts in the half-light. The air carried the permanent scent of diesel fuel, salt spray, and that indefinable metallic taste that comes from tons of steel. Sitting in the damp air for months at a time, Warehouse 7 sat at the farthest edge of the port complex, separated from the main cargo terminals by a quarter-mile of cracked asphalt and rusted chain-link fencing. It was the kind of building that looked forgotten even when it was busy. Its corrugated metal siding streaked with rust stains that painted abstract patterns down the walls like tears on a weathered face. Inside, fluorescent tubes hung from the high ceiling on chains that creaked whenever the wind picked up outside. Half of them flickered with the irregular rhythm of lights on their last legs, casting shifting shadows between the towering shelves that stretched toward the rafters. The concrete floor bore the scars of decades of forklifts and hand trucks, creating a maze of black tire marks and gouges that told the story of countless shipments moved through this forgotten corner of international commerce. This was where returns came to die. Packages that had been refused, shipments with incorrect documentation, containers that had been flagged for inspection, but never claimed by their intended recipients. Everything ended up here eventually, sorted into categories that made sense only to the bureaucrats who had designed the system decades ago and the handful of workers who had learned to navigate its peculiarities. The morning shift had already begun when Sarah arrived, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space as she made her way past rows of palletized goods wrapped in plastic sheeting. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played classic rock at low volume, the music bouncing off the metal walls and creating an odd acoustic effect that made it impossible to tell exactly where the sound was coming from. Marcus Delano looked up from his clipboard as she approached the processing station, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. 23 years he'd been working returns, and the job had worn grooves into his personality the same way water wears grooves into stone. Everything about him suggested a man who had long ago stopped expecting surprises from his workday. "Morning, Sarah. Got your assignment sheet right here." He handed her a stack of papers that felt heavier than it should have, each page listing items that needed to be cataloged, inspected, and either returned to sender or disposed of according to regulations that filled 3 binders sitting on the nearby desk. The other workers moved through their routines with the mechanical efficiency of people who had performed the same tasks thousands of times before. Janet Rodriguez operated the key barcode scanner with the rhythm of a jazz drummer, each beep marking another item processed through the system. Her gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had probably looked exactly the same every day for the past decade. Near the loading dock, Tommy Chun maneuvered a pallet jack around the narrow aisles between shelving units, his route optimized. Through years of trial and error, he knew exactly which corners were too tight for a fully loaded pallet and which sections of floor were uneven enough to tip a carelessly balanced load. The knowledge was written in his muscle memory, allowing him to navigate the warehouse obstacle course without conscious thought. The air circulation system hummed constantly in the background, a white noise that became noticeable only when it occasionally cycled off for a few minutes. The building had been designed for function rather than comfort, with industrial-grade everything and no concessions to aesthetics. The walls were bare except for safety posters that had been mandatory installations decades ago and now served mainly as markers of how long it had been since anyone in authority had paid attention to this particular corner of the operation. Sarah's designated workspace was a metal desk that had seen better decades, positioned next to a sorting area where returned packages waited in bins marked with codes that corresponded to disposal methods outlined in the procedural manuals. Some items would be returned to senders, others donated to charity, and a few would be destroyed according to protocols designed to protect both the Port Authority and the environment from potentially hazardous materials. The morning light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, creating dusty shafts of illumination that highlighted the constant movement of particles in the air. Everything in Warehouse 7 existed in a permanent state of gentle motion. Dust settling, plastic sheeting shifting in air currents, metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes. It was a place where time moved differently, measured. Not in hours, but in the steady accumulation of processed paperwork and the gradual rotation of inventory. A coffee pot gurgled in the break area, surrounded by mismatched chairs and a table that wobbled on uneven legs. The smell of brewing coffee mixed with the warehouse's permanent bouquet of cardboard, plastic, and that faint chemical scent that comes from cleaning products, applied according to the minimum standards required by regulation. Outside, the sounds of the active port carried on the wind, container cranes moving with their distinctive mechanical rhythm, truck engines starting and stopping, the distant blast of ship horns announcing arrivals and departures. But inside Warehouse 7, those sounds were muffled and distant, creating the sense of being isolated from the real business of international trade that happened beyond these walls. The assignment sheets detailed the day's work with bureaucratic precision. Each item required documentation, verification of condition, and determination of appropriate disposal method. It was the kind of work that rewarded attention to detail and patience, more than speed or innovation. The perfect assignment for someone the administration wanted to keep busy but out of the way. Sarah spread the paperwork across her desk and began the process of organizing her day, unaware that among the routine returns and refused shipments waiting for her attention was a container that would transform this forgotten corner of the port into the center of a federal investigation that would reach from Cleveland to Washington, D.C. and beyond. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 hours into Sarah's shift, when Derek Hoffman arrived unannounced, with 2 men in expensive suits who didn't belong in a warehouse processing returns. Derek was the kind of supervisor who measured his authority in the number of people he could make uncomfortable with his presence. Assistant Port Director for Customs Compliance, a title that sounded impressive until you realized it mainly involved reviewing other people's paperwork and finding reasons to criticize their methods. His thinning hair was always perfectly combed, his shirts always pressed, and his smile always carried the edge of someone looking for mistakes to document. The 2 men flanking him moved with the careful awareness of people accustomed to potential threats. Their suits were tailored well enough to hide whatever they might be carrying, and their eyes constantly scanned the warehouse interior with the systematic attention of professionals assessing security vulnerabilities. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't offer business cards, and didn't seem particularly interested in making small talk with the warehouse staff. "Sarah, I need to discuss some concerns about your processing efficiency," Derek announced loudly enough for the entire warehouse to hear. His voice carried the particular tone supervisors use when they want to establish dominance in front of an audience. "Your throughput numbers have been consistently below department standards." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring truck. Everyone in Warehouse 7 knew the processing standards were deliberately set at levels that required cutting corners on thoroughness. The only way to meet the quotas was to scan items quickly, check boxes on forms without actually verifying contents, and move packages through the system with minimal inspection. Sarah looked up from the shipping manifest she'd been cross-referencing with the actual contents of a returned electronic shipment. The numbers didn't match. which meant someone either couldn't count or was deliberately misrepresenting what they'd shipped. Following proper protocol required investigating the discrepancy, which took time that the efficiency metrics didn't account for. "I've been following standard inspection procedures," she replied, keeping her voice level despite the implied criticism. "Every item gets properly documented according to the compliance manual." Derek's smile tightened. "The compliance manual is a guideline, not a requirement for every single return. We need to prioritize volume over perfectionism. These aren't high-value shipments we're dealing with here." One of the suited men whispered something in Derek's ear, and his expression shifted from bureaucratic annoyance to something more pointed. "In fact, I think it would be better for everyone if you focused exclusively on the simpler returns. Basic consumer goods, obvious defects, straightforward documentation. Leave the complex shipments for staff with more experience in expedited processing." The reassignment was presented as guidance, but everyone in the warehouse understood it as what it actually was: a demotion disguised as workflow optimization. Sarah was being moved from potentially interesting work to the most mundane tasks available, processing returns that required nothing more than checking boxes and moving items to appropriate disposal bins. Marcus avoided eye contact as Derek handed him a revised assignment sheet, the kind of careful neutrality that veteran employees develop when management decisions create uncomfortable workplace dynamics. Janet continued operating her scanner with mechanical precision, but the rhythm was slightly off, betraying the tension that had settled over the normally routine environment. The suited men spent the next hour walking through the warehouse with Derek, paying particular attention to the sections where international shipments were processed. They asked questions about security protocols, documentation requirements, and the background check procedures for employees with access to sensitive cargo. Their interest seemed to focus on containers that had been flagged for additional inspection, but remained unclaimed by their intended recipients. "Some of these shipments have been sitting here for months," one of the men observed, consulting a tablet that displayed information not available to regular warehouse staff. "What's the protocol for disposal of unclaimed international cargo?" Derek launched into an explanation of the regulatory framework governing abandoned shipments, his voice taking on the eager tone of someone trying to impress visitors from higher up the administrative chain. The process was complex, involving notifications to senders, coordination with customs agencies, and eventually either return shipment or destruction, depending on the nature of the goods and the costs involved. "Of course, we prioritize efficiency in these determinations," Derek added quickly. "Extended storage costs money, and most of these abandoned shipments contain nothing of significant value. Consumer electronics, textiles, industrial components that were probably obsolete before they left their origin ports. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The visitors seemed particularly interested in a section of the warehouse where larger containers waited for processing. These weren't typical returns, but cargo shipments that had been refused by their intended recipients for various reasons. Incorrect orders, documentation problems, companies that had gone out of business before their shipments arrived. The containers bore shipping labels from ports around the world, each one representing a small piece of international commerce that had somehow gone wrong. "What kind of inspection do these receive before disposal?" the second suited man asked. His attention focused on a container marked with Cyrillic text that suggested Eastern European origins. "Standard visual inspection for obvious hazards, documentation review for customs compliance," Derek replied. "Nothing too intensive unless there are specific red flags. We're dealing with volume here, not forensic analysis." Sarah continued processing her reassigned returns, but her attention was increasingly drawn to the conversation happening 20 feet away. The questions the visitors were asking suggested concerns about security gaps in the disposal process. the kind of systemic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people with knowledge of how the system worked, and access to shipping documentation. Tommy maneuvered his pallet jack past the group, his practiced route taking him close enough to overhear fragments of conversation about enhanced screening protocols and potential security implications. The visitors seemed to be cataloging weaknesses in the current system, while Derek offered reassurances about efficiency and cost-effectiveness. As the afternoon wore on, the warehouse atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Phone calls were made to offices outside the building, conversations conducted in low voices that stopped whenever regular employees came within earshot. Derek spent most of his time away from his usual post, escorting the visitors through areas of the warehouse that normally received attention only during annual safety inspections. The message was clear to everyone working. Warehouse 7, something had changed, and the change involved scrutiny from people with authority that extended far beyond port administration. The routine work of processing returns was continuing, but underneath the familiar rhythms of scanning and sorting, tension was building like pressure in a steam pipe with a faulty relief valve. By closing time, the visitors had departed, but Derek remained behind, making additional phone calls and reviewing files that he normally left for his administrative assistant to handle. The warehouse staff completed their shifts with the uncomfortable awareness that their forgotten corner of the port complex had suddenly become interesting to people who didn't usually concern themselves with the mundane details of return processing. Sarah gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave, but not before noticing that several of the containers that had drawn the visitors' attention were now marked with new tags indicating priority processing. Whatever concerns had brought outside attention to Warehouse 7, the solution apparently involved accelerating the disposal of specific shipments rather than subjecting them to additional scrutiny. 3 days later, the pressure to move containers out of Warehouse 7 had intensified to the point where normal procedures were being abandoned entirely. Sarah arrived for her Thursday shift to find the warehouse transformed into something resembling an assembly line. Additional temporary workers had been brought in overnight, people she'd never seen before who moved through the facility with the efficient detachment of contractors, paid to ask no questions and complete specific tasks. They wore identical gray coveralls with no company logos, carried clipboards with pre-filled forms, and seemed to know exactly which containers needed immediate attention. The morning briefing was conducted by Derek's replacement, a sharp-featured woman named Linda Vasquez, who introduced herself as Regional Efficiency Coordinator. Her title was deliberately vague, the kind of corporate designation that could mean anything from cost-cutting consultant to crisis management specialist. She spoke with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to walking into chaotic situations and imposing order through sheer force of organizational will. Effective immediately, we're implementing accelerated processing protocols for all international returns, Linda announced to the assembled warehouse staff. Processing time per container should not exceed 15 minutes. Visual inspection only. No detailed inventory unless items pose obvious safety hazards. Marcus raised his hand tentatively. What about customs documentation verification? Some of these shipments have incomplete paperwork that requires follow-up with origin ports. Documentation issues will be handled by administrative staff after disposal decisions are made, Linda replied without hesitation. Your job is to determine whether contents match general shipping categories and move containers to appropriate disposal classifications. Speed is the priority. The new workers had already begun implementing the accelerated protocols on the containers that had drawn attention from the suited visitors earlier in the week. Sarah watched from her assigned station as items were removed from shipping crates. With mechanical efficiency, given cursory visual inspection, and immediately sorted into bins marked for various disposal methods. The process that normally took hours was being completed in minutes. Janet looked visibly uncomfortable as she was instructed to process customs declarations without cross-referencing them against actual container contents. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, she muttered to Sarah during their brief break. "Never seen anything like this. It's like they want us to not look too carefully at what we're moving through here." The temporal workers seemed particularly focused on containers bearing shipping labels from specific origin points. Eastern European ports, certain facilities in Central Asia, and a few locations in South America were receiving priority attention. These containers were being processed with even greater speed than the general accelerated protocols required, often moved to disposal classification before their contents had been properly cataloged. Sarah's relegated assignment to simple consumer returns meant she was working primarily with domestic shipments and straightforward, international packages containing obviously benign items. Clothing returns from online retailers, electronics with obvious defects, household goods that had been damaged in transit. The kind of work that required minimal attention and posed no security concerns, but her peripheral vision kept tracking the activity around the priority containers. Something about the process felt wrong beyond just the obvious disregard for proper procedures. The temporary workers seemed to know which containers contained what before opening them, consulting handheld devices that displayed information not available through standard warehouse systems. Tommy's pallet jackroutes had been optimized to avoid the sections where priority processing was taking place. When he asked Linda about accessing those areas to complete his normal inventory organization tasks, he was told that temporary staff would handle all movement in those sections until further notice. His 20-year familiarity with warehouse operations was suddenly deemed insufficient for areas of the building he'd been working in since before some of the temporary staff were born. By midday, the accelerated processing had created a bottleneck at the disposal classification station. Containers were being marked for immediate destruction or return shipment faster than the documentation could be completed. Linda solved this problem by instructing staff to complete paperwork after items had already been removed from the facility. A reversal of protocols that violated several federal regulations governing international cargo handling. "The important thing is maintaining workflow momentum," she explained when Marcus questioned the reversed documentation sequence. "Regulatory compliance can be addressed retroactively once we've cleared the backlog." The rationale was presented as a temporary emergency procedure, the kind of exceptional measures that large organizations sometimes implement when dealing with unexpected volume or deadline pressures. But to experienced warehouse staff, it felt more like a systematic effort to move specific items out of the facility before they could receive the level of scrutiny that normal procedures required. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the containers being processed under the accelerated protocols. Most appeared to contain industrial equipment, electronic components, and raw materials that matched their shipping documentation. But the speed of processing made it impossible to verify whether the quantities listed on manifests matched actual container contents, or whether items had been properly declared to customs authorities at their points of origin. During her lunch break, she walked past the disposal classification area and noticed that several containers marked for immediate destruction contained items that appeared to be in excellent condition. Industrial-grade equipment that showed no signs of damage, electronic components still in sealed packaging, and metal containers that looked like they'd been specifically designed for transportation rather than consumer use. "Why are we destroying items that could be returned to senders or donated?" she asked Linda during the afternoon status meeting. Cost-benefit analysis indicates that storage and return shipping expenses exceed the value of most items. Linda replied with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd answered similar questions many times before. Destruction is the most economically efficient disposal method for the majority of international returns. The explanation was technically accurate but failed to address why items of obvious value were being classified for destruction. alongside genuinely worthless returns. Electronic equipment that could be refurbished, industrial components that could be resold, and materials that clearly had commercial value were being treated as waste products, requiring immediate elimination. As the day progressed, the pressure to maintain processing speed intensified. Workers who asked too many questions about specific containers were reassigned to different sections. Documentation requirements were further streamlined to eliminate anything that might slow the movement of priority items through the disposal pipeline. The warehouse was beginning to feel less like a legitimate cargo processing facility and more like a mechanism designed to make specific shipments disappear from official records as quickly as possible. By closing time, more than half of the containers that had been waiting for processing at the beginning of the week had been cleared from the warehouse. The efficiency was impressive from a purely logistical standpoint, but the methods used to achieve it had created an atmosphere of controlled chaos where normal safeguards had been suspended in favor of speed. Sarah left Warehouse 7 that evening with the growing conviction that the accelerated processing protocols were designed to solve a problem that had nothing to do with efficiency or cost-effectiveness. The systematic effort to move specific containers out of the facility before they could receive proper inspection suggested that someone with significant authority wanted particular shipments to disappear from official oversight as quickly as possible. What she didn't yet realize was that her commitment to following proper procedures, even when assigned to mundane returns, was about to intersect with a container that would expose the real reason why Warehouse 7 had suddenly become so important to people with the power to suspend normal regulations. Friday morning brought the mistake that would change everything. Container MSK 47291 was supposed to go directly to the priority disposal line, but a temporary worker's mislabeled routing tag sent it to Sarah's consumer return station instead. By the time anyone noticed the error, she had already broken the customs seal and begun her standard inspection protocol. The container had arrived from a shipping facility in Odessa, supposedly containing industrial cleaning equipment returned. Due to compatibility issues with American electrical standards, the manifest listed 24 units of commercial-grade vacuum systems, each weighing approximately 40 pounds and valued at $300 per unit. Standard returns paperwork, nothing that should have attracted special attention. But when Sarah opened the first shipping crate, what she found didn't match the description. Instead of vacuum components, the crate contained 12 cylindrical metal containers, each about the size of a large coffee can but considerably heavier. The weight distribution was wrong for any cleaning equipment she'd ever handled. These containers felt dense in a way that suggested either solid metal construction or contents much heavier than anything that belonged in consumer electronics. The cylinders were unmarked except for serial numbers, etched into the metal with industrial precision. No manufacturer logos, no safety warnings, no handling instructions. The kind of anonymous packaging typically used for materials that required special transportation procedures, but needed to avoid advertising their contents to casual observers. Sarah lifted one of the cylinders from its foam padding and immediately noticed something that made her pause. The metal was warm to the touch, not from ambient temperature, but from some internal source of heat. Industrial equipment shouldn't generate warmth while sitting inactive in a shipping container for weeks. That's when her training kicked in. Before her assignment to Warehouse 7, Sarah had spent 8 years as a Nuclear Regulatory Commission inspector, specializing in the transportation and storage of radioactive materials. She knew the weight, feel, and heat signature of containers designed to transport enriched uranium. She recognized the specific type of shielding used for materials that required careful handling, but needed to avoid obvious identification during shipping. The cylindrical containers in her hands matched every characteristic of enriched uranium transport vessel she'd encountered during her previous career. The weight, the heat signature, the industrial-grade construction, and most importantly, the complete absence of identifying marks that legitimate manufacturers were required to include on any radioactive material containers. Her Geiger counter was in her car, a piece of equipment she'd kept out of habit even after transferring to Port Authority work. But she didn't need electronic confirmation to recognize what she was looking at. Years of experience had taught her to identify dangerous materials. Through physical characteristics alone, she carefully replaced the cylinder in its foam packaging and moved to examine the shipping documentation more closely. The manifest had been prepared with professional competence, listing items that would justify the weight and shipping costs without attracting customs attention. But the country of origin raised immediate red flags for anyone familiar with international nuclear trafficking patterns. Ukraine had been struggling with security at former Soviet nuclear facilities since independence. Enriched uranium had been disappearing from poorly guarded storage sites for years, sold to buyers who paid cash and asked no questions about end-use certificates. The trafficking routes typically moved materials through Eastern European ports before shipping to final destinations in countries with less stringent import inspection procedures. The United States was a particularly attractive target market because enriched uranium had legitimate industrial uses that provided cover for materials that could also be used in weapons programs. A shipment disguised as industrial equipment could pass through multiple inspection points without triggering enhanced security screening, especially if the paperwork was professionally prepared and the containers were designed to avoid detection. By standard screening methods, Sarah's hands were steady as she photographed the containers and documentation using her personal phone. She'd been trained to gather evidence methodically, documenting everything that might be relevant to a later investigation. The images showed serial numbers, shipping labels, and the discrepancy between manifest descriptions and actual container contents, but she also knew that her discovery had put her in immediate danger. People who traffic enriched uranium don't operate small-scale criminal enterprises. They have connections to international networks with the resources and motivation to eliminate threats to their operations. The accelerated processing protocols, the temporary workers, and the systematic effort to move specific containers out of Warehouse 7 without proper inspection suddenly made perfect sense. Someone with knowledge of the shipping schedule and access to Port Authority procedures had orchestrated a system to ensure that container MSK 47291 and others like it would be disposed of quickly, with minimal documentation, before anyone with relevant expertise could examine their contents. The efficiency improvements were actually a sophisticated smuggling operation, using legitimate cargo handling procedures as covered. Linda Vasquez appeared at Sarah's workstation with the abrupt suddenness of someone who'd been monitoring the processing area and noticed that container MSK 47291 wasn't moving through the disposal pipeline as scheduled. "I need that container moved to priority processing immediately," Linda said, her voice carrying an edge of urgency that hadn't been present during earlier interactions. "Administrative error in the routing system. That shipment requires special disposal protocols." Sarah looked up from the documentation she'd been photographing, her expression carefully neutral despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I've already opened the customs seal. Port Authority regulations require me to complete inspection and documentation before transferring open containers to different processing tracks. The regulations allow for supervisor override in cases of administrative error," Linda replied, consulting her tablet with the quick efficiency of someone who'd researched the relevant procedures in advance. "I'm authorizing immediate transfer to expedited disposal. No further inspection required." The exchange was being conducted with professional courtesy, but both women understood the stakes involved. Linda needed the container removed from Sarah's workstation before its contents could be properly identified and documented. Sarah needed to prevent disposal of evidence that could expose an international trafficking operation. "I'll need written authorization for the override," Sarah said, maintaining the bureaucratic tone appropriate for a routine procedural dispute. Opened international containers require supervisor signature for transfer between processing tracks. Linda's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm Sarah's suspicions. Someone accustomed to legitimate administrative procedures wouldn't have paused before providing required authorization for a routine transfer. The hesitation revealed uncertainty about how much attention the written request might attract from other administrative staff. "I'll prepare the authorization and return shortly," Linda said finally. "Please don't proceed with any further inspection until I return with the proper documentation." As Linda walked away, Sarah knew she had perhaps 15 minutes before the authorization returned, probably accompanied by security personnel with instructions to ensure that container MSK 47291 disappeared into the expedited disposal system. Her discovery had triggered responses that confirmed the systematic nature of the operation and the level of authority involved in covering it up. She also knew that her previous career as a Nuclear Regulatory Commission inspector, which had qualified her to recognize enriched uranium on site, was about to transform her from a warehouse worker relegated to processing mundane returns into the most dangerous person in the building. Sarah's phone call to FBI agent Rebecca Torres lasted exactly 90 seconds. But it set in motion a response that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Warehouse 7. Torres had been Sarah's contact during her final case with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, an investigation into missing enriched uranium from a decommissioned reactor facility in Pennsylvania. The agent specialized in nuclear trafficking cases and maintained a network of former NRC inspectors who occasionally provided intelligence about suspicious materials they encountered in their new careers. Container MSK 47291, Cleveland Port. "Authority, Warehouse 7, Sarah said quietly into her phone, reading the shipping information while keeping one eye on the approaching figure of Linda Vasquez. "Enriched uranium disguised as industrial cleaning equipment. Ukrainian origin, estimated 12 kilograms total. Active smuggling operation with Port Authority collaboration." Torres's response was immediate and decisive. "Secure the area. Don't let anyone move that container. The federal task force will be on site within 20 minutes. As Sarah ended the call, Linda returned with her authorization paperwork and 2 security guards who clearly hadn't been briefed on the actual nature of their assignment. They looked like standard Port Authority security personnel, probably told they were dealing with a paperwork dispute that required supervisor presence to resolve efficiently. "I have the transfer authorization," Linda announced, extending a clipboard towards Sarah with the confident efficiency of someone who believed bureaucratic procedures could solve any operational problem. "Please sign here to acknowledge receipt of supervisor override instructions." Sarah accepted the clipboard but didn't sign. Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing with the methodical precision of someone preparing official documentation. "I need to file a hazardous materials incident report before authorizing any container transfers." Linda's expression shifted from administrative confidence to something approaching alarm. "What kind of hazardous materials?" "The manifest clearly indicates industrial cleaning equipment. There's no basis for a hazmat report. Nuclear Regulatory Commission protocols require incident reports for any suspected radioactive materials discovered during routine inspection," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone citing regulations she'd helped write. "Container contents don't match shipping documentation, and preliminary inspection indicates possible nuclear materials." The words hung in the air like smoke from a warning flare. Linda's carefully maintained composure cracked as she processed the implications of having NRC protocols invoked in what was supposed to be a simple container disposal operation. The security guards exchanged uncertain glances. suddenly aware that their routine assignment had evolved into something beyond their training and authorization. "That's impossible," Linda said, but her voice lacked conviction. "These are consumer returns. There's no nuclear material in this facility." Sarah turned her laptop screen toward Linda, displaying the incident report form she'd been filling out. The document included photographs of the cylindrical containers, serial numbers, shipping documentation discrepancies, and a preliminary assessment based on physical characteristics consistent with enriched uranium transport vessels. "I've documented the discovery according to federal requirements," Sarah continued with professional calm. "NRC notification protocols are now in effect. This container is under federal jurisdiction pending expert analysis." The power dynamic in Warehouse 7 had shifted with sudden completeness. Linda, who had arrived with administrative authority to override local procedures, now faced federal regulations that superseded Port Authority jurisdiction. The security guards, who had expected to facilitate a routine container transfer, found themselves in the presence of potential nuclear materials that required specialized handling procedures. Marcus and Janet had gathered at the edges of the conversation, drawn by the unusual tension but staying far enough away to avoid involvement in what was clearly escalating beyond normal workplace disputes. Tommy had stopped his pallet jack operations entirely, recognizing that the warehouse routine had been suspended by developments that none of them fully understood. Linda's phone rang with the sharp, electronic tone that indicated a call from someone. Expecting immediate answers, she stepped away to take the call, her voice dropping to urgent whispers that confirmed she was reporting the situation to people who had significantly more authority than her regional coordinator title suggested. That's when the black SUVs arrived. Sarah watched through the warehouse windows as 3 vehicles pulled up to the loading dock with the aggressive efficiency of law enforcement responding to a priority situation. FBI tactical team members emerged wearing protective equipment designed for handling hazardous materials, their presence transforming Warehouse 7 from a mundane cargo processing facility into an active federal crime scene. Agent Torres led the team with the focused determination of someone who had been waiting years for a break in nuclear trafficking investigations that had produced more leads than arrests. She wore a radiation detector on her belt and carried documentation that would allow federal agents to assume jurisdiction over the entire warehouse operation within minutes. "Sarah Mitchell, NRC Inspector, retired," Torres announced as she approached, her voice carrying enough authority to silence the warehouse. "Entirely. Thank you for maintaining scene security. We'll take custody of the evidence now." Linda's phone call ended abruptly as she realized that regional coordination authority meant nothing when federal agents were citing national security jurisdiction. The temporary workers who had been processing priority containers throughout the week suddenly found themselves being questioned by agents with security clearances and access to databases that could verify identities and trace employment records back through multiple criminal justice systems. The cylindrical containers were carefully removed from their shipping crates by technicians wearing full radiation protection suits, each movement documented by agents with specialized equipment that confirmed what Sarah had recognized through physical examination alone. The Geiger counters registered positive for enriched uranium, validating her assessment and triggering protocols for nuclear crime scene investigation. Derek Hoffman arrived within minutes of the federal response, his administrative confidence replaced by the careful uncertainty of someone who had suddenly realized that efficiency directives from his superiors might have involved activities that extended far beyond normal Port Authority operations. His questions about jurisdiction and procedural authority were answered with federal warrants that superseded any local administrative concerns. The shipping manifest for container MSK 47291 was photographed, copied, and entered into federal databases that would trace its origin through Ukrainian ports, identify the shipping company involved, and map the financial networks that had funded its transportation to Cleveland. The investigation would expand beyond Warehouse 7 to include everyone who had handled the container during its journey from Eastern Europe to the American Midwest. As the afternoon progressed, additional containers that had been processed under the accelerated disposal protocols were retrieved from disposal facilities and subjected to federal inspection. Several contained materials that matched the uranium trafficking pattern, confirming that container MSK-47291 was part of a larger smuggling operation that had been using Port Authority procedures to move nuclear materials through American facilities. Sarah found herself being debriefed by federal agents who recognized her expertise and treated her as a crucial witness rather than a warehouse worker who had stumbled onto something beyond her understanding. Her former career as an NRC inspector had prepared her not only to recognize nuclear materials, but to gather evidence that would support federal prosecution of international trafficking networks. The power reversal was complete. Linda Vasquez, who had arrived that morning with authority to override normal procedures, was now being questioned by federal agents about her role in facilitating the movement of nuclear materials through American ports. The temporary workers who had processed priority containers were being interviewed by agents with access to international criminal databases. And Sarah Mitchell, who had been relegated to processing mundane returns as punishment for following proper procedures, had become the federal government's primary witness in what would develop into the largest nuclear trafficking investigation in American history. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the federal courthouse in downtown Cleveland, watching as the final defendants in Operation Steel Harbor received their sentences. The investigation had expanded far beyond container MSK-47291 to expose a trafficking network that spanned 3 continents and involved corrupt officials in 12 different government agencies. What had begun as Sarah's discovery of mismatched shipping documentation had become the foundation for dismantling one of the most sophisticated nuclear smuggling operations in international law enforcement history. Linda Vasquez received 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy to traffic nuclear materials, her regional coordinator position having been a cover for coordinating the movement of enriched uranium through American ports. The temporary workers who had processed priority containers were revealed to be members of an international criminal organization with connections to black market nuclear dealers operating throughout Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Derek Hoffman's administrative cooperation with the accelerated disposal protocols had been motivated by bribes rather than efficiency concerns. His 15-year career with the Port Authority ended with a 12-year federal sentence for accepting payments to expedite the processing of specific containers without proper inspection. The efficiency metrics he had imposed on Warehouse 7 were designed to ensure that dangerous materials moved through the facility too quickly for proper identification. The shipping company that had transported container MSK-47291 from Odessa was a front operation for a network that had been moving nuclear materials out of former Soviet facilities for nearly a decade. Their sophisticated documentation and professional packaging had allowed them to transport enriched uranium through multiple international ports without triggering enhanced security screening. Only Sarah's expertise had been sufficient to recognize what standard inspection procedures had missed. Agent Rebecca Torres received a commendation from the director of the FBI for coordinating the investigation that had prevented enriched uranium from reaching buyers who intended to use it for weapons development. The materials seized in Cleveland had been destined for a facility in South America where they would have been processed into components suitable for radiological weapons. The Port Authority of Cleveland implemented new inspection protocols based on recommendations from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, requiring specialized training for all personnel involved in processing international cargo. Warehouse 7 was redesigned with enhanced security systems and staffed with inspectors who had backgrounds in hazardous materials identification. Marcus Delano was promoted to warehouse supervisor, his 23 years of experience finally receiving the recognition it deserved. Janet Rodriguez became the facility's new quality assurance coordinator. Her attention to detail elevated from routine work to a position where thoroughness was valued over speed. Tommy Chun was appointed to the safety committee, his knowledge of warehouse operations contributing to procedures designed to prevent future security breaches. But it was Sarah's transformation that represented the most significant outcome of the investigation. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission offered her a position as Senior Inspector for International Nuclear Materials, a role that would involve traveling to ports throughout the United States to train customs officials in recognizing sophisticated trafficking operations. Her experience in identifying disguised nuclear materials had made her one of the country's most valuable assets in preventing weapons proliferation. The position came with federal law enforcement authority, security clearance for classified information, and responsibility for developing new protocols that would prevent future smuggling operations from exploiting gaps in port security procedures. Her expertise would be used to train inspectors at major ports from Los Angeles to New York, creating a network of professionals capable of recognizing nuclear materials, regardless of how creatively they were disguised. Sarah accepted the position, but not before completing one final task at Warehouse 7. She returned to her old workstation on a quiet Tuesday morning, 6 months after container MSK 47291 had changed everything. The warehouse looked different now, equipped with radiation detection equipment, enhanced lighting, and inspection protocols that required thorough examination of every international shipment, regardless of its declared contents or country of origin. The staff she had worked with during those tense weeks greeted her with a mixture of respect and amazement. They had learned about her previous career as an NRC inspector through news coverage of the trial, discovering that the colleague they had known as a warehouse worker relegated to mundane returns had actually been one of the country's foremost experts in nuclear materials identification. "I never understood why you were so careful with every inspection," Marcus admitted as they walked through the transformed facility. "Thought you were just being difficult about following procedures. Turns out you were applying expertise the rest of us didn't even know existed." The lesson had extended beyond Warehouse 7 to influence port security operations throughout the country. The case demonstrated that effective security required not just sophisticated equipment and detailed procedures, but personnel with the knowledge and experience to recognize threats that might not be obvious to standard inspection protocols. Federal agencies had learned that their most valuable assets were often people whose expertise appeared irrelevant to their current assignments. The investigation had revealed dozens of cases where former military specialists, retired scientists, and experienced technicians were working in positions that didn't utilize their specialized knowledge. New policies were implemented to ensure that expertise was properly matched with responsibilities that could benefit from specialized experience. Sarah's final report on the Quantità Warehouse 7 investigation included recommendations that extended far beyond nuclear trafficking prevention. She argued that effective security required creating environments where experienced professionals felt empowered to apply their expertise, even when their official assignments didn't seem to require specialized knowledge. The most dangerous threats, she noted, were often those that appeared routine to people without relevant experience, but were immediately recognizable to professionals with appropriate backgrounds. Container MSK 47291 had looked like standard industrial returns to everyone except someone who understood the characteristics of nuclear materials transport. As she prepared to leave Cleveland for her new position in Washington, Sarah reflected on the irony that her punishment assignment to Warehouse 7 had created the perfect conditions for exposing a major security threat. Her relegation to processing mundane returns had placed her in exactly the right position to intercept a container that might otherwise have moved through the disposal system without proper examination. The case demonstrated that expertise finds a way to surface, regardless of organizational efforts to minimize its importance. True professional competence doesn't disappear when it's not officially recognized. It simply waits for the moment when its value becomes undeniable. Asterisk. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen not because of sophisticated security systems or complex protocols, but because someone with the right knowledge is in the right place when hidden dangers finally reveal themselves. In a world where threats constantly evolve and adapt, the most effective defense is often human expertise that refuses to accept that anything is as simple as it appears to be. The enriched uranium that was supposed to disappear quietly through accelerated disposal protocols instead became evidence in a case that would protect countless lives from radiological weapons. And the warehouse worker who was meant to process returns without asking questions became the federal inspector whose expertise would help secure American ports against future nuclear trafficking operations. Excellence always finds a way to matter, especially when the stakes are too high for anything less than the best. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.